welcome everybody to another session of 4RG Meets. And I'm so glad that you could all be out here with us this evening. My name is Scott McKinley, and this is my co-host and wife, Beth McKinley.
So we always begin these meetings acknowledging that we in the Peterborough, Nogoji-Winong area are on the traditional lands of the Mississauga and the Chippewa. And we always state our gratitude for the way the original peoples of this land have been caretakers and stewards. And we remember that we still have obligations under those treaties, which are legal documents. The Canadian government stated that one of their priorities for COP15 included meaningful partnership with Indigenous peoples, but we all know there's much to be done on that front. And I think when we talk about a land acknowledgement, it's really relevant to point out that 80% of global biodiversity is on land that has been and is protected by Indigenous people who comprise only 5% of the world's population. So Indigenous people are key to moving forward, as well as all of us. So we're posting links on the For Our Grandchildren webpage, which will give more information and petitions from several climate groups, including Indigenous Climate Action, and the Land Guardians movement, about what Canada needs to do to honor those stated priorities and to respect the rights and well-being of Indigenous people who continue to be impacted by things like the tar sands project, pipeline development, old growth forest logging. And Scott just whispered under his breath that he did get those links put onto the webpage just before we started. And there's also a statement of support that the Land Guardians are asking people to sign to basically call on the Canadian government to make ongoing investments to support Indigenous-led conservation. So our speaker tonight is Kaia Douglas. She describes herself in her bio as someone who is lucky to have been raised by the Peterborough community, with a big nod, I'm sure, to her mom and dad.
And also to many of you, I think.
I think so. She's now in her second year learning at the College of the Atlantic in Maine, where she moderates the college governance. She organizes community potlucks, swims in the ocean, leads canoe trips, runs on the trails, and makes theater. In the summertime, she works as a tree planter on the mountain slopes of British Columbia.
Kaia had a few questions that she wanted to ask, and I've thrown in another one as well. And so you just pick the one that applies to you best for each of the questions. So first question was, during your lifetime, how would you describe the biodiversity in the area or areas that you have lived? And yes, 82% said it has decreased. How often do you think about biodiversity in your day-to-day life? And got a bit of a split here. 55% say often, 42% occasionally. And then the next question here is, did you follow what happened at COP15? And wow, good participation there. We got 76% did follow what was happening. Sort of a related question here. Have you heard of the Global Biodiversity Framework? And not as many people there. We have 58% yes, 42% no. And on the last question, how do you feel about the outcome of COP15? That assumes, of course, that you actually did follow it to some extent. And nobody's very optimistic. So that's predictable, I think. But the majority are somewhat optimistic, 52%. Take it away.
Yeah, hi. Hi everybody. My name is Kaia, and like Beth and Scott said, I grew up in Peterborough. So I went to high school at TAS in the drama program. The first time I went to a protest, it was to save PCBS. The first time I spoke to city council was about the parkway, and that was a really formative experience for me. So it's an honor to be back presenting to folks in Peterborough. I went to COP15 in December in Montreal, and I ended up there because I'm a student at College of the Atlantic, which is a small university on the coast of Maine, and a couple of my professors were going, and they have been involved in in the climate COPs and the biodiversity COPs for a long time. And so they brought a group of students with them, and I ended up in that group of students, and my badge said academic research. So I guess I was there as an academic researcher. But that's sort of the short way of how someone like me ended up at a UN Biodiversity Conference. And so going back about 30 years or so, there was the Rio Earth Summit, which I'm sure you guys probably know more than I do. But that was in 1992, and out of that, there came two conventions. So there was the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. These kind of two sister conventions. And the UNFCCC, the Climate Convention, stated that they should have the parties to that should meet every year. So that those are the COPs that we hear about, I think, more often, that are more in the media. But then the biodiversity, which is kind of the sister convention, said those meetings should happen every 2 years. So that's kind of why we had COP27 in Egypt, and then 2 weeks later had COP15 in Montreal, because the COP15 was the biodiversity one. And this year, this COP, the main goal was to agree on something called the Global Biodiversity Framework, or the GBF. And it's supposed to be a set of goals and targets that lead countries to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. So this framework is supposed to inform projects and funding and national implementation plans, so that the world can do something about the biodiversity crisis. And it was supposed to be in 2020 in China, but then because of the pandemic and everything, it was delayed a few years, and then ended up being, because of some of China's COVID restrictions, it was really hard for them to host a UN conference. So that's why it ended up happening in Montreal, 2 years delayed. And what happens is that every country that's party to the CBD, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity, they send delegates to Montreal, or to the COP, to negotiate the text. In this case, it was the text of the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework, and try to come to a text that they agree upon. And in this case, almost every country in the world is party to this convention, all except for the country I'm in right now, which is the US and the Vatican. And so in the COP venue, there's the main thing that's going on is the negotiations, where these delegates from the different countries are sitting around a table and trying to and negotiating the text. But there's also a lot of side events that were going on inside the venue, different groups organizing events, different groups of people having strategy meetings. You know, the NGOs would meet, or all the small island developing states would meet. Lots of media briefings. And then also, because it's in Montreal, which is a fairly politically active city, there were a lot of side events that happen outside of the venue as well, which is really cool. So in the university at UQAM, which is the Université of Quebec in Montreal, they opened up a space to hold a bunch of events. So even people who didn't have a badge to go inside COP could attend these other events that were biodiversity related. And there was also protests and marches, and there was a lot going on within this kind of closed venue, and also within all around the city itself. And so, yeah, I had never gone to a COP or done anything like this before. So it was all new experiences for me. And yeah, the COP venue is this massive convention center that even the whole block in front of it was all caged off. There was kind of a city square, but they caged that off. Tons of security to get in. You had to go through basically airport security with your bag and everything. You also had to show a negative COVID test to get in every day and get your badge scanned. And inside. It's like this really big, tons of massive meeting rooms, and massive escalators and stuff. It was kind of overwhelming to be in there. And yeah, I stayed in a hostel just down the street. And yeah, in terms of just like day-to-day life living at COP, that was also a new thing for me. Like where do you eat when you're at COP, and where do you sleep? And there was a lot of the side events would put out food for the people attending the event. So once they got their food and went into the event, there would be like a platter of some cheese and crackers and stuff. So there was a lot of that. The Canadian Pavilion also put out these maple desserts like all the time. So if you found the maple desserts, you like text all your friends like, oh my God, let's go get the maple desserts. But that was kind of like, yes, how to live inside that space. And a typical day, I'd wake up around 7 or so. I'd do my COVID test in the hostel. I'd go in, and then at 8 a.m. I would join the CBD Alliance meetings. So this is a group of NGOs that are mostly focused on the justice element of biodiversity, especially like voices from the global south. And so I would usually attend those meetings, and I found that was a really good way to get briefed on what happened the day before, because different people would have been in different spaces the day before and come back and kind of synthesize the information. So I'd start my day there. Then negotiations would start at 10 a.m. And I'd go sit in on the negotiations and try to understand what was going on. Maybe midday, pop out, grab a croissant or something at the little boulangerie beside. And then maybe I'd head down to the university to catch a talk or an event in the civil society space, and then come back for negotiations, have a meeting with my group to debrief everything, and then probably go back to negotiations and then go home around 10 p.m. every night. So it was a really intense day-to-day life. And then just watching the negotiations themselves, it was really at the start when I got there, I found it painfully boring, because all that was happening is there's this text on the screen, and all the text that's not agreed on is in these square brackets, and they're negotiating, do we take the brackets off of that word? Do we keep the brackets? Do we get rid of that word entirely if it's a question between like protect all land or protect land, you know? And they're arguing about whether to take the brackets off of the word all or not. And at the start, it just really, a bunch of people were describing it as the Olympics of the English language, because they would negotiate in English. And it was just like, honestly, watching people negotiate where a comma should be for an hour, it was kind of incredible. But I guess it's kind of, I also thought about it as, trying to get all the countries of the world to agree on a text. It's like a group project of your nightmares. But it's amazing that it can happen in the first place. But just still, it's a really, really hard to get a lot of people to agree on stuff. And we started with 900 sets of brackets in the text. And by 3 days before the end of the conference, there were still 700 sets of brackets in the text. So as I got to understand a little bit more the UN speak and understand the power dynamics that were happening underneath that were maybe invisible to me at the start, but like once I understand, when they say this, they actually mean this, or they're negotiating for that, it became a lot more interesting, because I could actually understand what was going on, because it was super inaccessible at the start. And I think one of the biggest things that shocked me at the start, or maybe I shouldn't be shocked by this, but was the amount of greenwashing that was in the COP, and the amount of corporate capture. It was quite astonishing. And it started, I think I first noticed it was specifically with Canada's PR game, and the images that Canada was promoting, especially as the host of this conference was really trying to promote Canada as a leader in biodiversity protection. And it started with, at the first plenary, there was Trudeau's speech. And he started by listing all of these images of what Canada is, and talking about how Canada is pristine mountains, and Canada is clean water, and Canada is all this shorelines, and Canada is vast boreal forest. And it was really like putting these images into our mind, and these images that I think we might be able to agree are really burned into the kind of Canadian psyche of what it means to be Canadian, is all these pristine landscapes, or at least that is like, those are the images that are presented to us. While in reality, the whole idea of land being empty or being pristine, I mean, land can only be empty if we kicked people off of that land in the first place, and it really stems from, the doctrines of colonization and of terra nullius, of that land can be empty, it can be free of humans. So that was really kind of, I guess I should have expected it, but it was like really in your face, the way that these images were just like being thrown at everybody there. Another word that was really a phrase that really came up a lot was this phrase called nature positive. Have any of you guys heard of what nature positive means? So it's this idea of basically nature offsets, that turning nature into an equation, and saying that a company or a country can be nature positive as long as, so you can still have nature loss as long as you have more nature gain. So maybe taking a book out of the climate change game of carbon offsets, but turning that towards biodiversity, which is it's hard for me to understand how you can offset biodiversity, because if one species goes extinct, then do you just replace it? What do you replace it with other species? Or if you turn one community's land into a mine, you say, oh, it's okay because we reclaimed land on the other side of the planet, and so we're overall nature positive. It's a way to commodify nature and turn it into an equation. And that was really, nature positive was really being put forward by groups like the World Wildlife Fund, as well as countries like ours and the EU and stuff. I would agree. So that was definitely another kind of example of greenwashing, as well as something called nature-based solutions, which was really being co-opted by business so that they can like basically commodify protection of biodiversity. And then protected areas was also, of course, a really hot topic at this COP, because there's a lot of different ways you can protect areas. And in the past, it's been done a lot by something called fortress conservation, which is basically like putting so-called walls around area of land and say, oh, no one can touch this land. We need to protect the biodiversity within it, which of course is going to kick people off of that land if people live there, and is removing people from their homes. And so then there was a lot of talk at COP about Indigenous protected or Indigenous peoples conservation areas, and Canada had a commitment, I can't remember how much, but to fund those, which is definitely hopeful as long as they're governed equitably. But at the same time, within the target that talked about Indigenous peoples conservation areas, Canada's delegate was arguing not to include that in the text, even after someone who was representing the the official Indigenous Peoples Forum for Biodiversity, when the leader of this official group stood up in this negotiation and said, we want our lands to be officially recognized within this target, still Canada's delegate refused to have that in the text and was arguing against it. So just interesting to see, you know, promoting that funding, but not wanting to recognize it in the text. Yeah, and then yeah, another big phrase that was thrown around a lot is this idea of 30 by 30. So protecting 30% of land by 2030 is the goal, and it got a lot of fanfare. It was probably one of the things that got the most fanfare at this COP. I mean, it just made me think a lot about if we can get people so excited about protecting land, and so many different groups and countries can get behind this 30 by 30 of saying it's agreeing that it's important to protect land. It made me wonder, what are we protecting that land from? Are we protecting it from, it seems to me we're protecting it from harmful industry and activities that are harmful to biodiversity, you know, such as tar sands and mining and big dams and those industrial forestry and industrial agriculture. If that's what we're protecting land from, then, and people can agree that it's important to protect the land, then why is it so hard to get people to agree that those industries actually have to be curbed? And that's the root cause of biodiversity loss. You know, if we can agree that 30 by 30 is a good goal to have, then can we agree that extractive capitalism is the problem? And then at the same time, if we're protecting 30% from something that is bad, then we're kind of agreeing that the other 70% is a sacrifice zone, seems to me, which definitely doesn't sit well with me. And so I think that, you know, conservation of land can be a really important piece of this puzzle, but the way it was being presented was kind of the you know, big ticket item, that this was going to be what saves biodiversity. And I just was disappointed that there was less talk about turning off the tap of why we need to protect land in the first place, turning off the tap of, you know, what are we protecting this land from? So that was a lot of what I was seeing inside the COP, was a lot of these greenwashing slogans. And there's like this whole tower that was like the nature positive tower, and all the side events seem to be something about nature-based solutions and 30 by 30, which I think was hard to just to be in that, and feeling like there was so much that wasn't being talked about. But I think by going to the side events that were outside the venue at the university, that allowed me to see a lot of other perspectives, that I think it just gave me a lot more energy to work in this space, especially perspectives of Indigenous people from different around the world, and especially around Turtle Island. And one of these groups is called the Muskrat Collective, a group of young people, mostly from BC, that were working to remove a dam off of their land in Tla'amin Nation on the coast. And this event, like, their words were just so powerful. It was such a charged space. It was this basement auditorium of one of the university buildings, and it was just it felt like such an intimate space. I was literally gripping my friend's hand the whole time that they were talking. And they were the group that interrupted Trudeau's speech, that speech I was just telling you about. They interrupted it and started drumming while he was naming off all of these images of pristine, wild Canada. And when they went outside, they kept drumming, and they walked out of the venue, and they were accosted by the police for a long time, and the police encircled them and wouldn't let them wouldn't let them leave, just encircled them on the street for a long time. And they were just trying to walk home, but the police encircled them, then finally, and yeah, threatened to arrest them, but didn't arrest them. Finally, when they walked home, the police followed them and stood outside of their Airbnb that they had rented for a few hours. And one of the lines that they that I remember one of them saying was that Canada is an extractive corporation masked as a state. And I just like, yeah, I want to let that one sit with everyone. And I mean, CBC News yesterday came out with the report that the RCMP Community Industry Response Group spent over $50 million in the last 5 years to protect extractive industry, mostly petroleum and forestry, from protests. These industries that had injunctions to keep extracting on Indigenous land. And then another group that was really interesting to hear was this group called Awid Nakyola, that just started in BC, and they're protecting forests in BC through the confluence of Indigenous knowledge, arts, and Western science. And I was just so I think enchanted by the way that some of the elders told this story about the salmon and the rivers and the forest and humans, and just how like that cycle of how it all ties together. And it also really highlighted again that colonialism is what is at the root of the biodiversity crisis, and we need to be deconstructing that at all levels of our lives. And then closer to home, talk to some people who are Great Lakes water protectors. And so first of all, I had no idea that the Enbridge pipeline goes right through the Great Lakes. I also didn't know that Enbridge's line 3, line 5, and line 9 are all the same pipeline, and that's part of their PR game to name it 3 different things so that it feels, too overwhelming to try and do something with the problem because there's so many pipelines. But that's one pipeline. And down in the States, there's a lot of work being done to actually stop the flow of that pipeline, shut down that pipeline. It was not designed to last until now. It's at so much risk of breaking, and if it breaks around the Great Lakes, that oil will spill into this amazing fresh water source. But even the Minnesota governor has put his support behind shutting down this pipeline. Enbridge is officially trespassing on an Indigenous nation now because they've evicted them. And there's seems to be a lot of solidarity in the States. So I hope we can try and build that same solidarity in Canada as well, and try to work across the border to protect these waters. And I was just really impressed and hopeful by how all these movements are already going. We just need to join together. And then looking further from home, there were also a lot of a strong contingent of different peoples from the Amazon forest. And I went to a talk about mining in the Amazon, and especially specifically Canadian mines and their role. And Canada's laws are basically the worst for allowing mining companies to be based in Canada and then extract in other places. And there's one company specifically called Bellow Sun that's looking to open a gold mine. And I went to a talk by some of the Indigenous elders that are leading the fight against it. So I think based on all of that, my takeaway was really because like Beth mentioned, that Indigenous people, although are only 5% of the world's population, they're stewards of 80% of the world's biodiversity. So biodiversity, when we talk about biodiversity rights, also talking about Indigenous land rights, and we can't have we can't stop the loss of biodiversity without actually addressing colonization and land rights. And so then going back into the venue, 'cause I spent a lot of time in these side events, especially the first week I was there, and then there started to be kind of fewer side events as things ramped up inside the venue again. And another big issue that we came up against was that of funding, because it's all great to come up with this text with all the goals and stuff of the goals and targets for the global biodiversity framework, but to implement these goals, it takes funding. And while wealth in the world is systematically distributed unequally, and so there needs to be flow from the global north to the global south to in order to implement these goals. And so there's something called the Global Environmental Facility, the GEF, they called it the GEF, that exists to kind of fund these things. But a lot of countries, especially the global south, were really advocating for a new separate biodiversity fund. Because in the climate sphere, there are actually 3 separate climate funds, but in the biodiversity sphere, there are none. And that's because the GEF, it has a lot of control from Western countries, especially the US, which is interesting because the US is not party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, but they have the most votes within the GEF in addressing who gets the funding, which means that countries like Cuba and Iran are completely excluded. And it's mostly really big countries like Brazil and Indonesia, countries that maybe have the resources to make fancy proposals for the funding that get it. And so there was a lot of push from Canada and EU and the global north to just have the funding go through the GEF, and also to take the burden off of countries of state money and more focus on private money, which is an issue because it gives more power to billionaires in if they're funding the projects and deciding where their money goes. And also the only ones that are legally have legally bound to provide the funding are the countries. So that's the only way we can have adequate funding. And so the global south is really advocating for having a separate a separate fund outside of the GEF. And there was even a walkout in the middle of the night at 1 a.m. during negotiations. A group of countries walked out and said we're done for the night because to raise awareness for needing more funding. And the global north owes a systematic debt to the global south for extracting their resources and causing this crisis in the first place. And so funds really need to flow, but most global north countries would not even agree to having the term of common but differentiated common but differentiated responsibility in the text, which has been in the climate text for a long time, but they didn't want to put that idea of responsibility in the biodiversity text. And it was kind of, some people described it as like a chicken and egg situation, that saying that the global north wanted to have more ambitious goals and didn't want to agree to more funding until they could have more ambitious goals, while the global south were very broad categories, but in general was saying, well, we can't agree to these ambitious goals until we know that we'll be able to implement them and funding. But yeah, there's no ambition without justice. I think ambitious was another word that I'm never gonna be able to hear again without having flashbacks. Because that word was definitely thrown around a lot, and I was like, ambitious for what? What does that mean? And so in general, there's definitely I learned so much, and there are a lot of moments that were really memorable and stood out to me. one of that was the march. There was a march for biodiversity and human rights, and ran into actually quite a few old friends at this march, which was just really, really cool to have that, know that there's a community in different places and run into people, there was, on one of the last days, there was a protest against RBC at one of their main branches in downtown Montreal. And I woke up this morning and it was a blizzard, kind of the first snow of the year. All the streets were all snowy. It was so cold, and went down to this. And there must have been probably 60, 70 people out at a protest in the middle of a blizzard against RBC. And Slado and her sister, who are some of the leading land defenders in the Wet'suwet'en protests, they were there and they spoke. And it was just really, you couldn't even, the streets were basically shut down. You could barely drive, and still so many people showed up to this event. And then later that day, inside the venue, there was an event that we saw on the schedule that was funded by RBC. So me and my friend went, and it was pretty like BS greenwashing presentation. But at the end, there was one of the senior vice presidents of RBC got up and spoke, just to say thank you and stuff. And so my friend and I didn't really let him leave afterwards, and we were asking him when RBC is planning to divest from fossil fuels and stop being on trespassing on Wet'suwet'en land. And he couldn't really answer us. But funny enough, Elizabeth May was also in the room. It was a really small room, probably 30 people in there. She was also there, and afterwards she was chatting with someone else, but she was kind of looking on as we accosted this RBC representative for it was a senior vice president and their climate communications person, and we had to explain the carbon cycle to these guys. But I think it was like an empowering moment, because there's a lot of disempowering feelings in COP, feeling like it's all like so big and beyond me. But I was like, okay, we had a conversation, and to their credit, they sat down and did speak with us for 20 minutes, and gave us their business cards at the end of it, which was kind of funny. I also got to meet David Suzuki, which was really cool, a side event. And it was in the evening, and it was one of those events with like some wine and snacks, and me and my friends are having a glass of wine, and then he was behind us, and I guess I was kind of starstruck, and I was like, oh my god, he's behind me, and I kind of looked back, and I was like, oh hi. And then he comes over and he was like, hey, I'm just schmoozing, I want to get to know who's here. And we were like, oh hi, we're students. And I don't know, he was just like, oh, okay, that's cool, and then walk to the next people. But that was cool to briefly meet him. So yeah, it's definitely there's just a few moments that stand out. Oh yeah, another moment that stands out is a late night negotiation. Must have been like 10:30 p.m. and they thought they were getting to agree on something, and then the EU blocked it and said, no, I can't agree to that. And then the moderator of this negotiation was so tired and so annoyed at this delegate from the EU that he just calls him out. He starts yelling. He's like, EU, I'm so disappointed in you. You keep doing this night after night, blocking negotiations. Are you here to negotiate, or are you here to like make life different for everyone? And the guy was kind of like, oh, I'm representing 27 countries. And then the moderator interrupted him and said, no, I don't want to hear about your 27 countries. You are one voice. Are you here to negotiate or not? So that was just interesting to see that kind of thing play out at a UN event, because you always think it's so, it always seems so like polite and withdrawn. I was like, okay, yeah, these people are definitely humans. So overall reflections from my time at COP, definitely the power dynamics was a big one. Even just something as simple as who gets to have their objects within the space. after the first day when those people from Tla'amin and other nations in BC were drumming during Trudeau's speech, then drums they could no longer have their drums within COP. They got taken by security coming in. Meanwhile, there are like towers and massive spaces devoted to stuff like nature positive and nature-based solutions. So just what, which objects get to enter the space and which objects and people get to take up space or not. And I guess also just the corporate capture and pretty bulletproof greenwashing. Like if you haven't been paying enough attention, a lot of the stuff that these people are saying is like, wow, yeah, that's awesome, and they know just what to say, and they know who to get to say certain things. So there's a lot of money that goes into that sort of PR game of greenwashing certain solutions. There was definitely, I felt a lot of dissonance between what was happening in the negotiation rooms and then what was happening in life and also in the side events. That the salmon are dying in the ocean, and then there's all these delegates negotiating about whether to put the comma there or there. Was just kind of like unreal and really disorienting and hard to get my head around. And there's a few Indigenous folks at COP that in some talks pointed out, like, Indigenous voices were a hot topic. Everyone wanted to have Indigenous representation and talk about Indigenous rights, but when it actually came to putting the money where their mouth is, it was addressing the root causes of colonization and of biodiversity loss, a lot less political will for that. But I guess political change, it needs to be urgent, but I understand it's a long game, and that my reflections and my takeaways are, reflect the fact that I've been a politically active human for maybe like 10 years or so. And so my view of time and of how fast political change should happen is kind of based on that. And so, maybe this COP is a step forward in that regard, that even though the global biodiversity framework text doesn't really fully address the root causes of biodiversity loss, that maybe the conversations that happened outside were a step forward. I don't know, because that was my first COP, so I can't really compare it to anything, but I hope that, maybe it's a step forward, and maybe the next COP it can just be a little more. But yeah, I mean, and some of those conversations started to happen in the negotiation room too. Shout out to Bolivia. There was one negotiator from Bolivia. He was alone. And, every time he could, he was addressing Mother Earth centric solutions and really trying to get, just the term Mother Earth in the text. But that was another power dynamic thing, was that some countries like Canada had so many delegates. So if you were negotiating until 1 a.m., you can sleep in the next day and you can do your best work. But if you're one person representing your country and you try to be in the room all the time, then you're going to be so tired. And how are you supposed to do your best work negotiating when you're so tired? So just another way that systematically makes it really hard to have equitable discussions. So anyways, I would like to show that video now, Beth and Scott. This is a video of the Namibian delegate, one of the Namibian delegates there, and it was the final plenary right when they adopted COP, and some countries were adopting the framework, the global biodiversity framework, agreeing on it together. And it was 3 a.m. I was back home at that point. I had left, but then some countries just giving their final reflections on it. And I just really, I think that this video of the Namibian delegate was really, really powerful. I'm going to show it.
Okay, I think she's got that lined up, ready for you to go. So she's going to hit the share button and everybody should be able to see it.
I would like to give the floor to Namibia.
President, Namibia would like to congratulate you on crafting a very finely balanced package deal which makes everyone equally unhappy, which is the secret to reaching agreement in the UN system. Mr. President, like my colleague from Mexico, I have a birthday, my daughter's birthday. She turned 24, and of those birthdays, I was only there for 12 of them because of working in the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this is my last meeting, so I speak freely. I do not care, actually, what anyone thinks. And I want to start off by saying that I have great sympathy for my colleague from the DRC, because he comes from probably one of the most brutalized countries in the world. Those of you who have read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness would recall that the Belgian colonizers in the Congo chopped off the hands of people there for not tapping enough rubber to meet their quotas. And Mr. President, that colonial injustice that is amplified by what happened in the Congo is the origin of all of the problems that we have encountered in this convention and in the relationship between humanity and biodiversity. We have suffered a systemic trauma that has disrupted the bond between humans and nature, that have led some countries to query whether we can include in this instrument a metaphor, a wholesome metaphor, like Mother Earth, the political objection to the idea that the earth is our mother. Mr. Chairman, if we're going to have any hope at all of living in harmony with nature by 2050, we need to acknowledge that the global economic and financial architecture that came out of the violence of colonialization, of resource extraction, of plantation agriculture, of colonialism to drive markets for the manufacturers of the countries that are today rich and control the resources of the world. The whole developed versus developing narrative, which has bedeviled our consultations in this forum for so many years, needs a much more comprehensive and holistic solution than what we have managed to craft in this global biodiversity framework. I agree that, and I thank the legal representative, that the adoption of this framework and of this package deal is a great moment forward for the world. But it is not the final step. It is not enough to get us to living in harmony with nature by 2050. And I'm very happy that we have decided to make this global biodiversity framework an iterative, flexible, adaptive process where we can all learn and share learning with each other and get better. Because we are very damaged, we are very sick. Our relationship with the living world is in real serious danger, and that endangers all of life on this planet. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for your leadership. Thank you everyone for the adoption of this framework, but there's a lot more work to do. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I wasn't there to watch it, but when I watched that plenary the next morning, that was the speech that stuck with me most. And so I know we're pretty much out of time, but I'll just try to wrap it up. Yeah, I think there was a lot of hard things to come away with from this COP, but I'm not like coming away, disheartened or depressed. I think that because this framework is only something that is a guideline for countries to use for when we make our national implementation plan. So the next step is that each country is going to have to take this framework and then make a more detailed plan of how we are going to actually be implemented in our context. And so I think that's really another leverage point that we can use of, okay, there's this framework, a lot of words, there's a lot of contradicting elements of the framework, it's a question of like, what do we actually focus on and how we interpret those words. And so I hope that Canada can have a process that's inclusive and brings people together to talk about how we want to implement it when it comes to making our national plan for this. So that's something that gives me energy to move forward. And yeah, another thing that I guess I'm thinking about a lot in light of all these images that were presented at COP and the images of like pristine nature or wilderness that were being really thrown out and pushed by the media and by the Canadian government. I really want to love and connect to land, not because it's pristine, but because people live there and because all land deserves to be loved, and not just what we consider as like typically beautiful land. And so, especially with the idea of protecting 30 by 30 and stuff, I'm pretty excited about spending time in the 70% and loving the 70% and fighting for the 70%, because I don't really want to live in a world that only cares about 30% of land and sacrifices the other 70. That doesn't seem right. So I want us to get excited about the 70% of land and the land that's been affected by humans and affected negatively by extractive capitalism, but still loving it and protecting it, because that's what we've got. And yeah, I guess a couple points that I really want to focus on after COP is for one thing, sharing what I learned and sharing my reflections, like here. I think I'll do another presentation for my school with my classmates. I moderate my college's governance system, so I'm just excited about taking my reflections from COP and watching these, international level negotiations and taking what I learned to work on good governance at my school level. Just community building and strengthening relationships between people seems really central here. I do a lot of theater, so I'm really inspired to kind of disrupt those images of untouched nature through theater and to celebrate and also mourn the earth that we belong to. And most importantly, skating on a lot of frozen lakes this winter. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody.
Wow, Kaia, that was amazing. You just covered so much in such a short period of time. I learned so much from you, and the way you put it together from the historical context, the negotiation process, the way you summarized the challenges, the politics, the power dynamics, the greenwashing, the impact of colonization, the funding of the global north and global south. That quote that you, I don't know if I got this right, but Canada is an extractive corporation masked as a state.
Yeah, that's from
and it's
some of the folks from the Muskrat Collective. So I don't want to take credit for that quote.
Yeah, and I think, that Indigenous teaching that we haven't seemed to learn as a culture yet, that it's all connected, right? And you just showed what all those pieces are and how they're all connected, and there were so many, and that you came away from this feeling positive is just so good for me to hear. The power of education, which is what you're doing for us tonight. There's a lot of really nice comments, people saying the same thing, that they've learned so much from you. The power of education and networking and seeing other visions and realities and coming together in solidarity Yeah, thank you so much. You know, we all love the 100%. And you know, when I kept hearing 30 by 30, I thought, oh, is that even possible? And then your comment is, yeah, what about the other 70? And then we all know how vital it is to be connected with nature. So how do we, yeah, we need the 100%. So thank you so much.
And thank you, everybody that came out tonight. Not a single person dropped off through the, usually we start with a number and then it starts tweetering off towards the end, but we hit 43 people and they're all still here. So thumbs up to that. There's a comment here by Linda Sunderland, and I think it wraps up what a lot of people are saying here. It's Kaia, you are a breath of fresh air and you give me hope for the future with your intelligence and enthusiasm. Good work, and thank you for sharing your adventures with us. And several more comments kind of saying the same thing. There's one very simple comment a little further down by Beth's brother, John Wood here, that says, Kaia is brilliant. And I agree. John is probably one of the more brilliant people that I know. So coming from him, that's quite a compliment. I'm going to jump in on that 70% thing, because even before you described it so eloquently, I was thinking, you know, the whole 30-30 thing, and I'm wondering, were there any discussions about instead of protecting specifically 30%, was there any discussions about how we develop and how we reintroduce or rebuild some of our developed areas, not to be pristine wilderness, but to be wildlife corridors, or at least wildlife friendly areas, and kind of rewilding some of the areas that we have developed, or is it just that, you know, that binary or that dichotomy of developed equals destroyed and saved equals pristine? So is there any discussion about that 70%?
I think so. Target 1, I think, is about what was it called? Spatial biodiversity, inclusive spatial planning. And I can't remember exactly. I remember watching the negotiation for that, and it was a question of whether to just say, you know, include land in biodiversity inclusive spatial planning, or include, you know, all land. That was the kind of question. I can't remember how it ended up in the end, but yeah, I mean, what I'm not too sure exactly what that means. I guess it just means in all spatial planning to be aware of biodiversity and wildlife corridors, maybe was my understanding. I'm not entirely sure. And yeah, I mean, 30 by 30, I guess, was one target, and there we ended up with 23 or so targets in the end. So there are targets that address the other 70%, but there's, you know, a lot of kind of little ploys in language that weakened those targets, so that they're less effective. For example, just off the top of my head, instead of, you know, reducing use of pesticides, it's something like minimizing the negative effect of pesticides, you know, so, or minimizing the negative effect of climate change instead of curbing climate change. So these word things, which, you know, it's really up to interpretation, but there are kind of little ploys to make these targets a little bit weaker, but hopefully we can still use them and make them stronger when it comes to Canada's implementation plan. Let's see.
Hey, the target 2 actually speaks directly to ecological restoration. In fact, the target reads that 30% of degraded areas should be restored back to their natural state by 2030. So that's pretty bold. It's ambitious. You like that word, Kyle? So yeah, it does speak directly target 2 to ecological restoration.
I was thinking about your comment on the long game, and that you haven't been in it all that long compared to most of the rest of us, or at least around to watch it as long as the rest of us. And I think that long game comment is an important one. It's one that I've talked about in climate change as well. where a lot of us, that are reaching into their 6th and 7th decade and beyond, we may not see the change that we're hoping for kind of reached within our lifetime. But what we're all hoping for is that we see the changes beginning to happen, and that we see signs of improvement, whether it's, with the atmosphere, seeing the CO2 coming down, or we're starting to see some of these agreements that you were witness to actually come to fruition.
Okay. Kaia, you said to me that there were 30 Canadian negotiators.
Something like that.
I'm really interested in persons of your talent and your brains being in leadership for Canada. I'm just asking you about these negotiators. Were they of a mind with you? Were they young? Can you see yourself playing a role there? And how are you going to go about finding yourself in a position like that for your country?
Well, I don't know. I don't feel like I should be doing that right now. Like I'm in my 2nd year of university. I have a lot to learn. I don't need to be like representing a whole country yet, and I don't think I should yet. I hope our country doesn't have to rely on 21-year-olds to represent us at the national level. I don't know. I personally, I don't think my brain is really wired to look ahead more than like 2 years. And I think a lot of people of my generation feel the same way, that like just because of the way the world is right now, like we can't really look like I can't really make plans beyond that. But when time comes, time will come. And I'm sorry, it's not a very good answer to your question, but I don't know. That's not in the near plans.
Well, you are an amazing speaker. We sure appreciated you giving us hope, seeing young women like you, and I should say, and men too, I suppose, speaking so well and so involved. It's really heartwarming. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Well, if there are no more questions, I think we'll call that a wrap. And
I've got one more, if you would, coming from your dad here, Kaia. As a guy who was actually there and has pondered this my own question myself, if you were to go back to COP15 or something, what would you do differently in terms of the way you engage and where you spend your time and what you're looking for now that you've kind of been through around?
I think the biggest thing would be the work that happens outside of COP. I think I showed up to this one pretty like unprepared, kind of just cold, and had to figure it out once I got there. So, and I learned a lot, and now I have a lot better understanding of how it works. But some of my friends and I are talking about probably getting geared up to go to COP28 for the climate COP in Abu Dhabi next winter, and that we want to start doing the work now of figuring out what our agenda is and what our main goals would be, and what groups we can collaborate with so that we can really hit the ground running. I think that's the biggest thing, that the COP is 2 weeks long, but the work happens the other 50 weeks of the year. So I'm not sure if I would do COP itself differently. I think that was just like my first COP to understand how it works. But in the future, I would want to show up with a lot more preparation and more of a kind of set agenda of having specific goals to put forward.
It sounds like a huge learning curve. And I was actually wondering, you said when you arrived, there was just so much going on, but that as you moved through the 2 weeks, which, you just summarized 2 weeks in a half an hour. That's pretty good. But you said that you started to have more insight into all of these different interconnected issues. And I was wondering, as you were talking, where that came from. Was it from the side events, or like, what were your sources of information that you found helpful?
One of my professors was really helpful with that. She's been involved in both the climate and biodiversity COPs for a long time. So she only works half time as a professor so that she can be doing policy work with different climate justice groups in the other part of her time, and writing papers and doing research and stuff. So I think it was really helpful to be able to talk to her about, like, okay, they said this thing in a negotiation, but what did they mean by that? And she sent us some, like, just papers and resources that we could read to have a better understanding. I think also the CBD Alliance meetings were really helpful. That was a group of NGOs that would meet every morning at 8 a.m. And those were mostly professionals and academics in the kind of justice space. So that was, that was really, really helpful to get a grip on the kind of undercurrents of the language that they were using.
Yeah, it sounds like you would really need that. I wonder, Cam, could I give you a minute to tell us about your students' presentation in Montreal?
Yes, it was. And folks, I'll just be really brief here because we've been on the call for a bit. And thank you, Kaia, for sharing. We had a chance to talk a little bit at COP here and there and over Christmas, but it was nice to see you put those all together. We had a very different experience at COP. I mean, some of the themes would be similar in terms of just sort of the scale of what's going on and trying to understand, as we did, just arriving cold. I mean, Kaia was at least there at the start of the conference. So kind of watched it evolve and got in. We arrived with 4 days left I'm talking about the Youth Leadership and Sustainability class from Peterborough here that went down. I think a number of you know that there was a group down there, grade 11 and 12 students. There were 20 of us. But it was, and fortunately we had passes inside because we were presenting at the Canada Pavilion. And that, of course, makes a huge difference when we're on the inside. But it was a different dynamic when we are traveling in larger groups. It was harder to sort of get into the deeper conversations and have the time. They're a bit younger as well. We didn't spend our entire days in the venue. We were doing some other things. We're at the Biodome. We were out for some fresh air. So we were kind of scratching the surface, but I think we did find a balance in, I mean, if you have a chance to speak to the students, I hope you do, that we'll be watching this this webinar on our own in class, but it really whet their appetite. So, Kaia did a deep dive, and she's I think got a bit of the bug. She's going to be following those things. I would say the same about the class, that this was for all of them the first time they'd been to anything like this. For some of them, it was the first time they've been away from home, actually. So it was very different experience to different people, and they sort of took different things, of whether it was some side events or whether it was the presentation they were doing or whether it was something they heard at the high level summit, like the video we watched. We debriefed a little bit after we got back, and all of them sort of had different highlights that they took away. But there was a lot of personal growth, I think, in the presentation that we did. Some of them were literally like really outside their comfort zone. So presenting in that forum at COP it was challenging for them. But I think afterwards, having worked through that, and sort of, I think they had in a small way their voice at the table, and I think it's sown a seed for more to come. So we're still processing through all of that in class. And I should just mention just quickly, we actually are moving it forward. We have a meeting with the mayor, with Jeff Leal and some councillors on Friday, speaking, I guess, to what Kaia was doing about really the localization of these. And so we're going to sort of tease the mayor and some councillors with what it might look like to localize the 23 targets that are coming out of this biodiversity framework. So because at the end of the day, it was negotiated nationally, but it needs to be implemented nationally, it needs to be implemented provincially, and ultimately it needs to be implemented in our own backyards. If you've made a mess of your backyard, you got to clean it up. I mean, there's the ecological restoration. So ultimately, I think this needs to come to roost here in Peterborough. We're sowing a seed with the mayor on Friday. I'm not sure if he knows anything about the COP outcomes, but at least we'll start that conversation. And the rest of you, I invite then to follow up as the issues unfold through this council's mandate, that all of this really should come to roost here in Peterborough. It was a special moment to be there with young people, for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you. All right. Well, thank you, Kaia, so much. And thank you all for coming to join us. Keep an eye on our webpage, our Facebook page, or our Instagram for an announcement for next month's presentation by Stephen Bocking, Trent University professor, who's going to talk about carbon capture, and is that the solution, as some would have you believe it to be?
I just have a quick question for Kai. I'm just interested in knowing whether or not there was much in the way of discussion of, let's say, biodiversity education, nature education. Did the education piece show up in any way from what you could see? Just because, I'm asking that because it's something that's so sorely lacking, in our education system today. And there's such a lack of knowledge of, local biodiversity. Kids, or adults for that matter, struggle to name, 10 native species, name 1,000. Corporate logos.
I really wasn't aware of biodiversity education within the COP venue. I don't think any of the goals or targets address education, unfortunately. I know there was at least one event that happened outside of the venue, and I might defer to my dad because he was a panelist on it. I was not there, but yeah.
You're right, Kai. It's not none of the 23 targets. To me, Drew, you're absolutely right that I don't know how. I'm really curious how that didn't end up square in there. But there was a side event that I was invited to speak, and I actually took 5 students along, 5 YLS students, and it was called Mainstreaming Biodiversity Education at a National Level. So what do those pieces look like if we want to try and roll this out? And it was kind of an interesting group. Most of them were the big players in the, the Canadian Wildlife Federation and Earth Rangers and some of the larger NGOs that have an educational role. But I was really the only one sort of mainstream, if you will, teacher that was there speaking to it. And really what we were trying to do with it, the students were kind of speaking to the importance of experiential education. This is the YLS students. And talking about how critical it's been for them to understand the relationship between, for example, the climate and the biodiversity crisis. But just going from that, I will just make a little leap. If anybody's looked at the Reframe Festival list, it was released today, I think, and you'll see a film called Rewilding the Classroom. And that's a film that I'm producing with Rodney Fuentes about the YLS program. And it's not meant as a plug for the YLS program. What it really is a call to educators, a broad call to educators in the board across the province and beyond, just to step outside the classroom and do exactly what you've done all through your teaching career, Drew, to get kids out there and be able to have a sense of where they are, and then make the larger connections to policy and between issues. So you can help when the film sees the light of day, which will be, I think it'll be debuted at Reframe this year. You help me get it into the right hands and to get those conversations going, because I think you're absolutely right. We need to be, the people that are graduating from our institutions need to be biodiversity and climate literate. And I'm afraid, sadly, most of them are not right now.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you and good night.
Good night.
Yeah, thanks you guys.